This may come as a surprise to you, but public housing in the United States doesn't really exist. It's basically a misnomer. There is no Vienna Housing Commission to charge rent and build units. There is no Singaporean HDB to help people save for their first home in a public housing unit. Indeed, in the United States, the government has maintained a complex, exclusionary method of solving what should be a straightforward issue, to the detriment of not just the working poor, but urban planning and city life in general. Let us explain and go into what the current system is, why the United States lacks public housing infrastructure, and what we can do to change the current trajectory. Public housing traditionally has been a system of government-operated and managed homes. According to the Housing and Urban Development Department, public housing was established to provide decent and safe rental housing for low-income families, the elderly, and persons with disabilities. Public housing comes in all shapes and types, from scattered single-family houses to high-rise apartments for elderly families. There are approximately 970,000 households living in public housing managed by 3,300 housing authorities. Public housing, then, isn't solely meant for the homeless. It is meant for the elderly, poor, and disabled persons. Many people who receive Social Security benefits, whether because they are elderly or because they receive what is called SSDI, or Social Security Disability Insurance, live in public housing as a rule. Those are people on a fixed income who often cannot afford a market rate apartment by default. According to the Social Security Administration, the average monthly benefit for a person on SSDI is $1,277, with payments depending not just on your age, but on the income which you have earned prior to taking on the benefit. That money is supposed to not just pay rent, but for all living expenses. I will leave a link in the description down below if you would like to know more. The first public housing in the United States was built in 1934 under the New Deal's Public Works Administration, which saw a whites-only housing estate built in Atlanta called Techwood Homes. Originally, the housing estates would include a mix of income levels, and although invariably built with a lot of federal money, they were operated and maintained by state and local offices on tenant rent. The initial intent was that the rent money would go towards upgrading and maintenance. In 1937, 160,000 additional units of this type were authorized to be built. Until the time that white residents became incentivized to leave behind city life for suburbia, public housing kind of lived up to that ideal, for the white residents, of course. Little record exists on black-only public housing, but let's be honest, I wouldn't be shocked if it actually did exist. As the white residents moved out, housing estates that once were totally segregated would open their doors to the lower-class minority groups who had no other government programs. The overall effect of this reduced tax base and existing segregationist policy across the country meant that these people in these areas became devoid of economic opportunity. Now, I mentioned earlier that HUD has over 3,000 housing authorities across the country. That means that there are over 3,000 localities whose job it is to maintain homes originally built with federal grants owned by the federal government. Stop and think about what that realistically means for cities who saw this kind of flight in residents during the civil rights era, the 1950s, 60s, and even into the 70s. American cities typically rely heavily on property taxes, whether they're from commercial or residential properties, in order to pay for services. Do you think they can sustain the level of maintenance and care to public housing if they have a dwindling tax basis? I don't believe they could. The fact is that a process of neighborhood disinvestment, which is the systematic disinvestment of capital from a locality and reduction in city resources, occurred. This leads to worse schools, less investment in public infrastructure, and public housing being far down on the list of priorities for a city government that is cash poor. When governments started seeing the money they could generate from building out rather than up through property taxes, they gave out incentives to those they wanted to move in, and those that could leave did so. Today, the process to get into a HUD-managed housing estate is long and complicated. Once you are assessed as being eligible, despite what people say, it is not free housing. Instead, your rent is heavily subsidized, and you pay for your rent out of your benefits. Means testing, the process of cutting off benefits after a person reaches a certain income threshold or goes over a certain amount of annual income, is common with government programs. In my personal opinion, this process leads people to remain in poverty. They have no feasible way to leave public housing without a major windfall if there are no saving schemes to help them leave. When you are poor, every expense counts. The middle class in the United States experiences similar types of traps all the time, where they are too poor to afford a medical expense or college, but somehow are considered too rich by the government to get any kind of aid. This same system applies even more on the lower end, where, to be generous, making $50 over the income threshold may mean you lose $500 in equivalent benefits. Typically, HUD housing is used by seniors and those on SSDI with disability. In the 1990s, local housing authorities were permitted to designate certain buildings as being for seniors and disabled only. This is not the only system of public housing, however. Another system, commonly called Section 8, is a voucher system for renting on the private market, also with an income limit. The Nixon administration created the Section 8 housing voucher program to allow low-income residents to obtain housing on the free market at a reduced rate. Due to private sector involvement, it isn't a traditional public housing program, but a voucher system. State governments at the time were told to figure out whether it was okay to discriminate with those on the voucher system or not, as well as how many vouchers to give out. The Section 8 system over the decades has been used to gut public housing authorities of their managed properties, and it doesn't generate revenue. Of course, the intent on paper is for the poor to choose where they want to live, but the actual number of vouchers is small relative to community need. Waiting lists are so long that it feels like a lottery more than a system designed to help you. Whether you're living in a Section 8 home or a dedicated housing development, often you don't have economic opportunities nearby, and public transit is an afterthought. The idea of a mixed-income housing estate like Singapore isn't possible by design. This is the income limit to qualify in the Bridgeport metropolitan area around where I grew up. As we can see, the average family income in the region is functionally $100,000 annually. A family of 4 would need to earn under $79,900 to qualify for any kind of rental support. These income limits effectively keep those who want to maintain subsidized housing in a trap of not earning too much to be seen as overqualified, with the fear being that if you earn even $1 over the limit, you won't be able to find an alternative that's affordable once kicked off the program. Due to the suburban nature of American towns, a car is likely necessary to get to work and get groceries. Zoning laws being what they are, public housing was and still is, with very rare exception, slotted into parts of the city disconnected from business and transit. If planning officials try to build more public housing near existing businesses or existing residential areas, there's often pushback. See all of California. The Nixon administration, in addition to Section 8, the orders are, like many things from this era, napkin-scribbled organizational memoranda demanding that no new public housing programs could be started, and removed presidential support for existing federally managed programs. Under Bill Clinton in the 1990s, the Faircloth Amendment was put into HUD internal policy, further limiting the scope of housing capacity, cutting it down to basically nothing. As a matter of policy, Faircloth said that no new public housing could be authorized if it meant that the housing authority would administer more stock than it did in 1999. According to HUD's own statistics on this matter, there are many communities today that have less than half of their allocated stock built. Many just saw it easier to tear the buildings down. While HUD does offer grants, such as the Hazard Capital Fund, to help support refurbishing efforts, they only offer $20 million. Today, the Hope 6 program seeks to privatize existing housing stock for sale in the open market, moving the government's role almost entirely out of public housing. While housing authorities mostly lack the capacity and funds to act, it doesn't have to be this way. I would more than love to see local housing authorities adopt aspects of the Singaporean model, or even look to Central Europe. That is, in both cases, think of the full picture when developing these spaces. Schools, clinics, parks, and other amenities should be close by for residents to access. The best way, I believe, to change an area long neglected is to bring life back to it through investment. On that level, specialized investment accounts to raise money for construction of new public housing estates might help alleviate budgetary issues at the state level, allow for residents within the state at all income levels to put money down from that account into a specific unit they'd like to lease. While I don't want to get too into the weeds as far as contracting for how these things would be built, I think having a separate contract for architecture and a separate contract for actual construction would be helpful in allowing residents to pick out their unit and to know what it is they are investing in. Giving an equitable discount based on income would be preferable to locking people out via means testing if they happen to earn a couple $1,000s over whatever limit you would want to suggest. Rich people would ultimately buy on the private market anyway. In an era of rising wealth inequality and inequity, public housing can be resilient and support communities if it is given the capacity to do so. As I'm recording this, a piece of legislation is working its way through the House of Representatives to change HUD procedure and remove the Faircloth Amendment that's been in place for over 2 decades. This could very well remove some of the barriers to reform. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below on this topic, as I often don't see public housing come up when it comes to urban planning and how we design our cities. Thank you for getting to the end of this video. Until next time.